Chair, we can begin when you're ready.
Well, thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate it. So we'll go ahead and call this study session to order. And I don't think we need to do a roll call. So I'll go ahead and send it over to Mr. Smith for a presentation.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will turn it over to Paul Hodgins and Tyler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to kick it off, we have both of our budgets for the study session. I'm going to ask Tyler to go through the first few slides of the PowerPoint. As you know, we went through the full high-level presentation in March. The first couple of slides really address what we've changed since March. So I thought rather than go through all the slides again, we would just open it up for questions after we talk about what's changed, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right. So Tyler.
Thank you, Paul. Mr. Chair, members of the board, here's an overview of where we started our budget development process back in September of this year and the steps taken to get where we are today. So we delivered preliminary operating budgets to your member city staff in October. We also met with your staff during the November financial working group to get into the details of those budgets and assist with any questions. As we know, your budget process starts early and they were very well preparing for those same budget discussions at your member city budget office. We continued refining those numbers into February and presented the annual budgets for information during the March cycle. Based on the feedback, as Paul mentioned, we've refined some of those numbers. We've made some adjustments downward since we presented in March, and I'll share that information with you on the coming slides. I'd really like to thank our board members and your member city staff for all the great input, good discussions and feedback along the way. I would also like to note that the full draft budget documents have been posted to our public website along the way in this process. We first posted in late February for the March committees and then again in early May, incorporating those comments and changes for the May committee cycle. For each posting, we let your member city staff know they were out there, provided the link to the page. And also want to thank the budget team. They've done some great work into the budget development process and documents this year and really assisting in responding to member city inquiries. So moving into the RTA. So we are using the official ADOT Public Transportation Fund forecast that we received back in September for our FY22 budget and 5-year plans. So that really puts us at 178.2 million for FY22. I want to mention that the half-cent sales tax does expire in December of 2025. So you'll see there are only 6 months of receipts planned in the forecast. However, for our budgeting purposes, We have assumed that an extension of Prop 400 continues for the remainder of fiscal year 26 at the same half-cent tax rate.
If I could just add very quickly on that note, we did receive our April revenues yesterday from the Department of Revenue. The April revenues were 18.1 million, which is a record high for any month since the beginning of Prop 400. That brings our 10-month total to about 152.2 million, which is 13 million ahead of budget. If we continue this trend for the last 2 months, we're likely to collect about 182 million this year, which is actually higher than what we've put in the budget, higher than the ADOT forecast for fiscal 22. So I still believe the ADOT forecast is a fairly conservative number moving into the 22 budget.
Thank you, Paul. So taking a look at the changes since the last time we presented to the board in March. For operating, we received an estimate, an updated estimate from City of Phoenix for both their fixed route and demand service that they provide and we fund with PTF. Although the costs are up slightly for fixed route, the overall change is a reduction due to the additional CARES and CRISA money applied. For the capital budget, we recategorized the regional fare collection system replacement into regional projects instead of member agency disbursements, really to give it some more visibility and better categorize those costs appropriately. We've also updated our pass-throughs to the rail PTF program, the capital program, really based on timing of the construction projects. So here's a look at the uses of funds for those changes from March. Overall, our operating budget has been reduced by $2.8 million, leaving us with our updated operating budget of $208.9 million. So you see that although fixed route is up a bit at 1.1 million from that updated estimate, demand services is down by 4 million. So. And then on the capital side of things, very minor adjustments to RTA capital, again, recategorizing the member agency disbursements and regional projects, and really truing up the PTF usage for VMR on the pass-through side of things. Total impact is $800,000 increase for capital. However, that's really due to the VMR capital true-up that I mentioned. So overall, with the adjustment on the operating side of things of 2.8 million reduction and the increase in capital, we're still down $2 million in total from the last time we presented. So with that, Mr. Chair, we can open it up for any specific questions that you may have, or I can walk through the full presentation before we get into the VMR update.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay. Pat, do we have anybody out there? I see people, but does anybody have any questions?
No one is responding in the chat.
Okay.
So I believe if you have a question, board members, if you'd like to just jump in with your questions, or if you want Tyler to give the full presentation, which is whatever the preference of the board members are.
I would say let's just go ahead and do the full presentation, and if it spurs a comment or two, then we'll go from there.
I'd be happy to do that. All right, so moving into the details of the 22 versus 21 budget comparison, looking at sources of funds for operating. Total sources are at 167 million for FY22. That's a $9.5 million increase over FY21. What's important to note here is with the CARES Act money going away in FY22 and the CRISA funds coming in at a much lower rate, CRISA almost half of that, less than half. You'll see that PTF and member city contributions or transit service agreements also go up and really offset that change in federal relief money.
So if I could add to that just very quickly, we did not include any of the American Rescue Plan funds that we know are coming. MAG Regional Council is expected to act on that allocation this month, and we continue to have some discussions with our financial working group, and then through next month, coming through the committee process, we'll have some discussions on how best to use those funds as we discuss the transit life cycle program. It does not including those does not necessarily have an impact on the budget. You're approving, the expenses. The additional ARP funds would really just offset some of the public transportation funds and the transit service agreements, the local funding. So it just affects the funding side. It wouldn't impact the cost side. But I just wanted to note that those are not included at this point as we continue to have discussions around that. Thank you.
So what percentage of the operating budget is based off the COVID relief funds?
So right now, or for fiscal 21, the CARES Act was almost a third of the sources of revenues.
Okay.
With just the CRISA and a little bit of carryover on the CARES, it's probably, trying to do quick math here, 22 million out of 167, 12, 13% maybe.
13, okay.
But then, with the rescue plan funds, it would increase that significantly.
And none of those funds are being used for ongoing operation issues, are they? Is that correct?
Those funds are being used to offset our operating costs,
Okay.
particularly, any of the increased costs related to COVID, the additional cleaning,
Okay.
things of that nature, but also helping to offset losses in fare revenues.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
this
Go ahead,
is Mario Paniagua, representing Mayor Gallego today from the city of Phoenix. Just a quick question on the ARPA funds in terms of the process. I just wanted to understand when you, Paul, when you talk about that coming back through with the TLCP, will there be a decision by the board on how those are allocated?
Mr. Paniagua, yes, we anticipate bringing it through in June for discussion purposes, presenting a couple of different scenarios and how they impact the TLCP through the end of Prop 400. Ultimately, that would be approved by the board when we come back with the TLCP for the board to approve.
Great, thank you.
Okay, moving on to uses of funds for operating. Overall operating costs are at 167 million, up 9.5 million. Fixed rate operations accounts for 4 million of that increase, or 4% in total. Demand service operations are up 6.5 million. This is really a result of less federal relief funding program for FY22. So when we reimburse City of Phoenix for the demand service that they operate, that's ADA, PTF funds can pay for that. So really, we reimburse them a net amount. So having more federal funds applied to that in 21 versus 22 has increased that net amount for reimbursement, but still lower.
Actually, before we move off that slide, I do want to point out, we have looked hard at our administrative costs. We do have reductions in kind of the administration and finance and the regional services. We made reductions in fiscal 22 over fiscal 21, but knowing that we still have some significant projects that we're working on looking forward. We want to continue to support the Prop 400 extension discussions with MAG and the planning around that. We want to continue with our fare collection project. There will be a significant amount of public outreach and public discussion as we move forward with changing our fare collection system, implementing our reduced fare ID. So, we focused on those projects, but at the same time, really looked hard at the administrative costs and made some cuts there. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Moving on to operating pass-throughs. So really, Pass-throughs are made up of VMR staffing costs, Arizona Lottery Funds Management, and Regional Area Road Funds Management. I want to note that all staff are employed and paid by RPTA. However, work spent on Valley Metro Rail related activities versus RPTA activities are tracked on timesheets. And any of that Valley Metro Rail effort is reimbursed at 100% by Valley Metro Rail to RPTA. So you can see that on the sources of funds, VMR personnel costs directly offsets the expenses for that. Total pass-throughs are $41.9 million. Moving on to sources for capital. Total sources are $73.7 million. That's a decrease of 13% over prior year. The bulk of those funds are made up by PTF and federal revenues for fleet and purchases on other capital projects. On the next slide, we can kind of look at those expenses. So for regional fleet, it's really down 11.8 million. We have less bus and van pool replacements program for our fleet. We have had quite an impact on our van pool program with COVID and working from home, so we've adjusted that downward. For regional facilities, it is up by 1.2 million, mostly due to consulting services and some of the work we're doing with Glendale on the Glendale North Park and Ride and Avondale bus stop improvements. So overall, year to year, we're down 11 million. Taking a look at the pass-throughs for our capital program, these are 100% dedicated to Valley Metro Rail's share of the PTF for its capital program. And so directly related to the construction activities and capital replacements that go on at Valley Metro Rail. This is a look at our reserve fund target levels. We do have a policy in place that identifies each reserve fund and the target level that we should be holding to. And so the reserve targets are based on these 5 reserve funds. For FY22, our reserve balance, our target balance, I should say, is 37.3 million is what we should anticipate having. Based on our use of reserves program for 22, we'll actually be above this target by 29.5 million.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this is Bill.
Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
Sorry, Bill, I was muted. Sorry about that.
I thought I was. Hey, Tyler, can you go back one slide, please?
Yep, we'll get there.
Well, yeah, or whoever's got the controls. So you're talking about our reserve capacity is 29.5 million over. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, the minimum level we want to obtain is 37.3 million. Based on where we're at today for 22, we should be 29.5 million over that minimum amount.
Okay, so, and where do these, I'm going to say, for the lack of a better phrase, excess funds come from?
Well,
Like, how did we get here?
Yeah,
30 million is a lot of money.
Yes.
It's a lot of money.
So it's part of the, I mean, basically part of the transit life cycle program. We you know, our public transportation fund revenues come in. Typically, you know, when you look at our capital program specifically, it's very dependent on fleet replacements. So it's up, it's down. So years where we have excess revenues over our expenses, it just adds to that fund balance. And then any years where, you know, maybe we have large fleet purchases, we would take out of the fund balance. And so that's all kind of managed through the transit life cycle program to ensure that we have funding through the remaining life. So I would expect that excess to decrease or to decline through the last few years of Prop 400. But it's really just a function of the revenues that come in and really against our capital program.
Okay, but isn't the this has nothing to do with the emergency fund, which is set at $1 million. Is that what I'm reading correctly? Our emergency reserve fund is $1 million.
Yeah, the board adopted the reserve policy back in January, I think it's January of 2016, and that was one of these were the 5 areas that we had in the policy.
Right, so to put this in city terms, the general fund operating reserve is technically our rainy day fund. 17% of the operating expenditures, correct?
I don't know that I'd call it a rainy day fund. It's really ensuring that we have cash on hand to meet our ongoing operating costs. A lot of what we do is on a reimbursement basis, so we just need to ensure we have cash to pay our bills. That's kind of the way I look at it.
Okay. Do you happen to have handy what last year's reserve was compared to the target? Or is that in the budget book somewhere?
I will look it up.
Okay, thanks.
We should have it.
And we can go on. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, it's Lauren.
Yeah, Lauren.
Question. So can you go back to the slide we were just looking at? Thank you. So basically, I know in the cities, are these included in the budget then? Or are they basically, are these allocations in the budget, or are these basically fund balance that's, I just want to make sure I understood Paul's explanation. For example, the general operating reserve fund, is, at least well, the way I understood your description is that the intention is to spend this down.
So the general operating reserve, I wouldn't say we would spend it down. It's a target amount to ensure that we have cash to meet our ongoing needs. The capital reserve, I would say, that's restricted. It comes from some different sources. The working capital reserve is really tied to mostly the Valley Metro Rail disbursements. So we want to ensure that we have funding to meet those needs. What we're really talking, when I say spending down, it's really that excess that we would be spending down. We don't want to spend our reserves down below our target level.
Okay, thank you. So I do have another question. In light of the current escalating costs for and the delay in supplies and being able to acquire supplies, is there a need to increase our contingency on capital projects?
It's a good question that hasn't come up with our capital development staff that I know of. I think the major projects we have should have plenty of contingent, or I shouldn't say plenty, should have enough contingency for the projects. I don't believe we would need to increase contingencies, but we can. No, Henry's shaking his head. No, we don't have a need to increase contingencies for our capital projects.
Okay, what about when we're doing basically, like forecasting? Do we, maybe not actually for projects that are, that are getting funded and that are underway, but I know this is, a few years back, but, the forecast of the amount of how big the project was going to be able to, and I'm speaking with regard to Glendale, and I don't know if this is necessarily a budget issue, but it's probably things we should be talking about, is forecasted the amount of money was going to be able to get that project into downtown Glendale. By the time we actually got to, really, nailing down the project, it was not going to get really even close to downtown Glendale. So, and I feel like that problem's getting bigger, not smaller. So I don't know if we need to talk about, in our ongoing, on how we're looking at forecasting, and if we're building some of these, real world issues into our forecasting, so we don't end up with a project that we're committed to that we can't fund?
That's a great question, Lauren, because just looking at everything today, I mean, it's all over the news. The cost of labor, the cost of supplies, everything is increasing at a rapid rate. And I can't believe that we're not forecasting or trying to do some future forecasting to identify that as an issue.
Yeah, I mean, just for example, let's say the north extension going up to Metro Center, I would imagine whatever the anticipated or the original forecast of the cost of that project, and it's currently underway, but I just don't know how we're going to be managing these increasing costs. I mean, I know they're unavoidable, especially for projects that are underway, but I mean, it's a real world problem that we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with. We can't just say, well, we don't have enough money to go all the way to Metro Center. I mean,
Yeah, for existing projects such as the Northwest Extension Phase 2, we do have a guaranteed maximum price from our contractor. So I don't envision that we'll see those types of requests come from our contractor to increase costs. That should have all been accounted for in their bid. But for future projects where we're not in the construction phase yet, certainly we do have for the capital extension, for instance, our cost estimates today would have a much higher level of contingency than what we have in a project that's under construction, for instance. So I mean, we do look ahead when we do the planning for a lot of these projects, have more contingency, look at the labor markets and see what the impacts might be. It's just a little different for a project that already has a GMP under construction. We don't necessarily have the same level of risk.
But there is a risk there, isn't there, Paul? Because I mean, couldn't a contractor come back to us at any given time right now and just say, look, the cost of labor, for instance, has skyrocketed, and I can't find those laborers that I once had at that cost, and so now I've got to do a budget adjustment in order to cover that project. You guys are not anticipating anything like that happening over the next, course of the next year on any project that we're working on?
If I could take that, Vice Mayor.
Sure.
Our construction projects, as Paul said, are entered into contract, and this is part of the FTA process also, where the guaranteed maximum price means that the contractor is taking the risk of the situation that the scenario that you indicated.
Okay.
Now, if there are changes in the project, if there are scope changes that either Valley Metro or the city partners that we work with on these projects come in and request, then those are issues that we debate, we analyze, we look and see if we're willing to do that. The other thing is that capital projects under federal guidelines have significant reserves and contingencies. As a matter of fact, in some of them, it's up to a 30 to 40% contingency. Otherwise, the federal government will not issue a full funding grant agreement. The idea being that even with a guaranteed maximum price, there could be things that happen that would entail adjusting a budget, and the federal government wants to make sure that we are fully covered with our contingency on those projects. So the problem with existing projects, I believe, is taken care of through both the FTA CIG process and our own budgeting, and through the manner and contracts that we have with there being a guaranteed maximum price. The issues on the projections for future projects, that is an issue that is common, and it is getting more and more complex, and it is something that we deal with and everyone around the country deals with because of escalating prices, changes in things. I mean, we got lucky in some cases. Nobody anticipated a 25% tariff on steel, for example. Well, we use a lot of steel in building a light rail project. And so if you're projecting out what a future project may cost, that's something you may or may not know. So we deal with that as best we can, and it's something we always have to keep our eyes open to, because it is a real challenge to be able to project out years in advance what these very complex projects cost.
Thank you. All right. Anybody have any other questions or?
Just real quickly, Mr. Chair. So the So are these policy, like the 20% capital reserve fund, 20% of non-federal capital projects, working capital 17%? Are these all basically based on existing policies? All of
Yes,
these?
we had, all of these were adopted in 2016 by the board as part of a reserve fund policy.
Okay. All right, thank you.
And just to make sure we can clarify, these reserves and that are different than the specific project contingencies that we just discussed. They're different issues. The projects have their own contingencies and their own financial considerations over and above the things we're talking about here in these budgets.
Just, you just made me think of something, Mr. Chair. So I know we adopted a policy in Glendale that if the project exceeds its contingency, that has to go back to the council. Just because sometimes, obviously, there's a way to go back to the general fund and finish funding projects, but do we have a policy that addresses if it was to exceed contingency, then what happens?
Mr. Chair, Councilman Tomachoff, on a major project, let's say like South Central, that in effect is the case. Because the budget is set, the federal contribution is set through the full funding grant agreement. If we were to exceed the contingency that's set aside, that means we'd be exceeding the budget. And there is a process for utilizing contingency, and contingency in major rail projects is different than what you may see in your city, but it still functions similarly from a budget standpoint. And if we were to exceed that, we would be out of contract approval, and we would have to come back to the boards and probably a city council, because there would be city funds involved also. And if we were to exceed those numbers, that we would have to come back to both Valley Metro and the city involved for approval to spend any excess monies or any additional monies.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Chair Edwards, this is Robin.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you. Hey, just one of the things I just wanted to bring up, and I think Lauren and Bill kind of captured it a little bit here. In AFS, we had a lot of discussion over this reserve slide, actually. And one of the things that we had asked for, and hopefully might be helpful, is if we do get that information regarding the prior, let me make sure I get this make sure I get this right, but our previous numbers, so we can visually see what the graph looks like in regards to what our reserve numbers are, whether they're in excess or whether they're deficient, so we can kind of see what those trends are. I know that was something that Bill and Mayor Gallego thought would be really helpful, that we could have a visual, so we could really understand what our reserves look like today and what they've looked like in the past. And then also the discussion about how that excess dollars were going to be spent and reallocated within the budget. And so hopefully that's going to be some more information that we're going to get prior to our next meeting. I think that's going to be really important. And then another thing you guys continue to talk about, which I think was helpful, and I think Tyler mentioned that the ability to be able to do this, is where we are in our current 5-year forecast. Would be really great to see that when we talk about the budget, so we can kind of understand where the forecast was and where it is, not just where we're going from this point forward, but how we got to where we are today. So some of these things that, AFS continues to work on, and try to just make sure that we're being as transparent as possible and having all the information, not only for AFS, but also for the board, so it's easy to understand. It's within some of these slides. So I think that we can kind of just get a context of where we are in the budget today, and where we have been, where we intended to be, and where we're going. So hopefully with this conversation and some of the conversations we've been having in AFS, we can get that information and data to be right in front of us.
Thank you, Robin. So Scott, I'll ask a question. When the information that Robin is talking about, is that something that's going to be presented to us prior to next Thursday's meeting, so that we can have some time to review it, so that if there are questions, they can be addressed ahead of time by staff?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure we'll be ready in the next week to have that. One of the challenges kind of looking back is we have to ensure that the assumptions on service levels, for example, are consistent. So when we changed, what we assumed last year in a fiscal 22 as part of our 5-year, if the service assumptions are different than what are in the budget today, we have to have a way to reconcile that. So we're just kind of working through some of those issues on how best to present it so that it's apples to apples. And I don't know that we'll have that by next Thursday.
So I have a question then. If the people that want to have those answers answered don't have it, how can they feel comfortable on voting on a budget next week that they may not have the answers to?
Well, I would ask if whether there's a comfort level with the budget next week, and whether, looking at kind of historical, how we move through our 5-year plan, if that's something that approving the budget is contingent on that, or if that's something that we just can work through over the next few months, going into the next budget cycle.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Bill.
Clay Goodman, sorry. As a new board member, I would feel very uncomfortable moving forward with a budget without having seen some historical information. So just for the record.
Budget.
Scott, you want to chime in?
Well, I'm asking Paul for some clarification.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. One of the challenges, not challenges, but differences in how we approach our budgets, and perhaps the city does. I know you all have 5-year forecasts and things, but we truly are a Prop 400 driven spending, and that's why our life cycle, you hear a lot, and a lot of what we plan for is both annual in nature, but it's also life cycle in nature. 5 years ago, that was a 10-year life cycle. And so when we looked at things such as reserves, there were annual needs and that's why the board established a lot of these guidelines and target levels. But there's also how the regional funds play out in both through the life cycle plan as to what it would play out related to service levels and expenditures over multiple years that would then culminate in December of 2025. And I think one of the things Paul's talking about is as we compare our annual expenditures with how it fits into what's going to happen now, since we're closer to 2025, over the next 4 years, over 4 budget cycles, that's sort of part of the reconciliation we're looking at. And that's what's slightly different than maybe some cities, how they approach is because we are both an annual, but we really are driven more by the life cycle when it relates to regional funds as it relates to how these things will play out. The goal being at the end of 2025, this will balance out. Both it will balance out on the macro level, and then also, and a lot of discussion recently with your staff is on things such as jurisdictional equity. How the regional funds that have come in, the Prop 400 monies that have come in, have been allocated and spent, and these reserves theoretically will go down, and in a perfect world, many of the reserves would be right down to exactly where the board said. There will be things like capital issues that go beyond and aren't related to Prop 400. But as far as operating monies and things we spend on putting out bus service, a lot of that is dependent upon the life cycle and the assumptions, as Paul said, that go into the multi-year assumptions related to life cycle. I know that may not answer the question perfectly, but it also may give a little indication as to why it's not as easy just to put a 5-year in and have it match up exactly like Paul said, because you have to look at what assumptions over the next 4.5 years of the TLCP play into that impact on the current year's budget. Paul, did I explain it accurately?
That makes sense.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thank you for that explanation, but I find it very disconcerting that information is not readily available. I would expect the administrator of this budget would have that information readily available for the board.
But I would say the budget document does include actuals. It includes some history for fiscal 20 as well as a comparison with our fiscal 21. So I mean, we do track all of that. It just doesn't necessarily answer the specific question about, how does 22, the proposed 22 look compared to how we might have thought it would look a year ago or 2 years ago. That's just an additional step that we haven't included in our budget document, but I mean, we do have historical data.
I understand that, Paul, but don't you find it concerning that you've got 4 members of the board here asking you very similar question, and yet you're going to expect them to approve a budget a week from today without having the answers that they want?
Well, yeah, I agree. We could certainly look to answer those questions as quickly as possible. Again, if we need to push approval to June, we have the ability to do that to ensure that we answer the questions. If that,
like I said, I'm just concerned with this many people. I mean, we don't even have the full board on the phone here, but just with the members that we do have, there's a consensus that they're not getting the information that they're wanting in order to make up their mind and a comfort level to cast a vote on a budget. And I just think that we need, I'm not saying that we postpone it, but I think it's behooving on you to get them the information that they need so that they can put to rest in their mind that they're comfortable voting on a budget that makes sense for them.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
This
ma'am.
is Monica Dorsey from El Mirage. And as a new member on this board, I am trying to find my way, and the more information that I can get, the more comfortable I will feel approving a budget. This is a large budget, and I would like to have this kind of information, and so I would lend my voice to that request.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, Paul, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Were there any other questions on the annual budgets? If not, we'll move on to our 5-year forecast.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair, this is Mario.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Just one more. This is something that the City of Phoenix had requested to Valley Metro's budget team. We're still waiting for a list of the vacancies, the current vacancies that Valley Metro's got, so that we could take a look at that as we analyze the budget. So we're hopeful that we can get that really soon. I think we were hopeful a couple of weeks ago. So would appreciate having that. And then I do have another question. I think we're still waiting for a meeting on this, but it's Phoenix's understanding that Valley Metro is negotiating with Total Ride on potential new higher rates for the services that they provide. And so I just want to know what the estimated increase might be at this point and how that impacts the budget that's being presented.
I'll answer that question, Mario. We are in that process of having those meetings. I do believe we have one scheduled with your team to go over that information. We are meeting with individual cities because the total ride situation impacts cities differently depending upon the type of service that they purchase through us from Total Ride, and then we're going to meet with all together at the end. So I can't tell you right now what the budget impact would be because it really depends upon what course of action the cities who are involved in that service decision make. We're putting out what has been proposed by and asked for by Total Ride, and we're discussing the situation. But the final disposition of that is totally dependent upon the feedback we get from the cities in the West Valley and the city of Phoenix regarding what ultimate solution they would like to continue to provide service in the Total Ride service area. So that won't be known until we meet with everybody and then sit down together and compare notes and get direction as to what the city specifically would like to do to proceed.
Thank you, Scott. Do you have any idea of how you'll make the necessary adjustments once that information is known?
Well, we're going over with each city. One of the reasons to go over with each city is to reflect to them what we think an estimated impact would be on that specific charge or change in the pricing from whether it be Total Ride or other service provider if Total Ride isn't the one to provide the services. And we're going over with each city how it would impact their IGA, how it would impact their the regional funds that are utilized to pay for services, and which is one reason why we need direction, because it absolutely will have an impact potentially on, well, all the cities, either directly or indirectly. Some cities more than others, because some cities, for example, if you're Avondale or Peoria and you purchase or other cities and purchase circulator service, that's a different issue than if it relates to express service, which is paid for out of regional funds. But each city is being given a specific number as to, based on the current estimates, how that would impact the IGA that they have with Valley Metro. So at the end of the day, that will be the cumulative impact on the budget related to that service situation, whether it's with Total Ride or some other provider. We do expect the costs to go up simply because that's the situation that we find ourselves in. But we'll know better I believe those meetings go into next week, and by the end of next week, we'll have some definitive answers for the city and the regions.
And we do have some contingency in the budget that would allow for some changes in those costs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions right at this point.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, it's Lauren. I do have a question and a comment. I'm happy to have the Total Ride issue brought up in front of the board. I'm a little surprised it hasn't shown up in the CEO's report previous to this, because it has been, I mean, we've heard about it from staff, but it hasn't formally been presented to the board as an issue. So I appreciate that happening today. I'm curious, are you meeting the cities one-on-one, or are you encouraging collaboration? Because I know I discussed with our team, I meet monthly with our team so that we can get, we can get all the information in one room, because you have several different committees and everybody meeting. But we're meeting once a month. And when we talked about the Total Ride, are we looking at doing maybe things that are outside the box, for example? And we haven't discussed it with Phoenix at all, Mario, but things like, I know our express route buses are still they're not full. And I don't know what the situation is in Phoenix, but we run an express route, which is a Total Ride contract down from 55th Avenue and Union Hills, essentially downtown. Now, if our bus isn't full and the Phoenix bus that picks up at I-17 or Bell Road isn't full, why aren't we looking at collaborating and saying we're going there, working on IGAs with other cities where we can coordinate together to reduce our cost and do things like that? I mean, a lot of this stuff is, I think, going to require a little more regional conversation, direct city to city. And I'm wondering if Valley Metro, as the, basically governing body, Regional Transportation Authority, is looking at helping put together some of those conversations so we can work together to try to maybe help each other resolve some of these issues and keep our costs down.
Great
Councilmember,
point. Yep.
Councilmember Tomachoff, first of all, the provision of service is our driving consideration as it relates to Total Ride. And first of all, the preservation of service and a resolution that would allow us to provide the highest level of service at the best cost. You're assuming that we have not had those discussions that you talked about, and I can assure you that we have had those discussions. First of all, we met previously with the entire group of West Valley cities and the city of Phoenix to inform them of the issue, to go over and get some feedback and direction from your city staff related to the issue. We use that information then to go back to Total Ride to discuss options and to discuss concerns and to discuss different things. At the same time, our staff has been talking with your staff on the very kind of creative solutions you're discussing. As you mentioned, each city has slightly unique needs and slightly unique issues. And so we're discussing and meeting with individual cities to address those specific needs as it relates to that city. However, these meetings are not taking place in silos. We are discussing, and the whole intent and what has been scheduled is that after we get the specific input from the city staff, that we meet together again as a group to lay out what we have learned, and so that every city can then make a decision as it relates to the combination of the impact of them individually and as the region as a whole. And many of the issues you've brought up as far as changing levels of service, ways we provide service. We have an exceptional issue in the West Valley because Total Ride actually owns the facility through which we stage 42 buses every day. And so that comes into consideration. And all these things have been discussed in detail with your staff. And we were prepared, obviously, to come back to the board when we actually have a proposal for the board to be able to present for your action should that be required. We're not there yet. We hope to be there within the next week or so. And as we finish up the meetings, I found that these individual meetings have been very helpful for us and for the cities. We've been able to have a open and complex and deep discussion with them. But we've always focused primarily on how do we maintain service to our residents and the people that we serve in those cities and in that region. And that there's many answers to that. We just want to come to a uniform answer that serves both the needs of the region and individual cities before we come back to the board for your action on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Bill.
Yes, sir.
So back to the slide before us, Paul. How does this reserve fit into perhaps covering that unexpected gap in this total transit discussion? You know, isn't this what that is for from an operating perspective, to cover that gap in this unexpected situation instead of hitting each individual city?
Well, yeah, yes and no. There's specific types of services that we can't fund with our Prop 400 money, circulators being one of them. So there are circulators involved with this issue. So while this type of reserve and, the operating reserve would assist with anything that's Prop 400 funded, it doesn't necessarily help with the, local circulators, anything that's locally funded.
Okay, thanks.
I don't see any more questions, so go ahead and continue, Paul.
Okay, moving on to our 5-year assumptions for operating. So we have included the FY22 to 26 short-range transit program service changes in our fixed route assumptions. Demand service projections for paratransit and ride choice, both of the programs that we operate are expected to increase by 3% each year. For fare revenues, we've anticipated these to increase with the return to front door boardings in FY22, combined with our return to ridership over the 5-year window, and an anticipated fare increase that will come up with our new fare collection system in FY24. Federal preventive maintenance revenues are anticipated to remain stable, just short of 2% each year in the 5-year window. So here's a look at our 5-year ridership recovery plan, or estimate, I should say. Total boardings are projected to be 15.5 million by FY26, which is really when we anticipate being back to normal boardings. You can see a boost to the average fare with the fare collection system replacement scheduled for FY24. Moving on. So for fixed route service, here's the total miles that we've budgeted. in our 5-year window. I do want to note that we have updated this slide based on the updated estimate that Phoenix provided. It was not included in the packet, the adjustments, but it's really around the cost per mile. So we worked with City of Phoenix staff to get that corrected for the Phoenix rate. So expected to have 15.6 million miles of service by the end of our 5-year window. Onto our paratransit and ride choice programs. So trips are expected to increase by 3% each year, and the same with the costs. We are looking at a procurement that would go into effect in FY23 in order to save some money by joining the 2 contracts. So I believe that's up for procurement right now. It's still being scoped right now. I apologize. Still being scoped right now with your member city staff input and our ATS group. And so we plan on hopefully realizing some savings with having one unified contract for the program. Here's a look at the total sources and uses in thousands for the operations for the 5-year window. Again, we're using the official ADOT forecast for this period. And total sources uses are at 1.1 billion for that period. Moving on to the capital assumptions. We have 102 million program for bus fleet. Mostly these are replacements of existing fleet. We'll note that we do have a placeholder for expansion buses should we need them, depending on member city and local revenues. Van pool fleet is programmed at 17.2 million. I want to note that that's 100% federally funded. We do anticipate that program coming back from current levels. We're working with a large employer in the Valley right now that may be able to increase that sooner than later, the participation. Paratransit fleet replacements continue for RTA service as well as member cities, providing the local match in those cases for member cities. And then the facilities and equipment is programmed at 13.5 million. Glendale Park and Ride, you can see the fare collection system upgrade that we mentioned, and state of good repair.
Mr. Chair, this is Bill.
Yes, Bill.
Tyler, if you can go back one. And we explain for everybody what happens to the bus fleet expansion units if we choose, for whatever reason, not to expand that. Of that 102 million in capital, what happens to that money that's being programmed if it does not include those expansion buses? And let's say, there's a certain number of replacement units that we end up not replacing. I realize 85% of it is federally funded. So the 15% that's PTF, where does that money end up flowing back into the system as?
So essentially, as Paul mentioned, PTF is tracked through the Transit Lifecycle Program for our operating and capital usage. So essentially, if we don't want to move forward with that, we can reprogram that for future use within the model.
Right, so it would end up in our fund.
Give us an example.
It would end up in our fund balance, and so then through the Transit Lifecycle Program discussions, it could be reprogrammed for another capital use. Perhaps it's a park and ride transit center that one of the cities is working on, or even to support some of the operating costs through the end of the Prop 400. But it would be reprogrammed through that TLCP process.
So if I could, what happened? Let's say you had $1,000 in the fund balance, in the PTF fund balance that's being programmed through the Transit Lifecycle Plan, or TLCP. Let's say what happens, Vice Mayor, is exactly what you said, that let's say $10 of capital funds are not used because we don't buy the buses. Now that budget now is what I say, $1,000 we started at. Now the budget, and let's say it's $100 in canceled orders. Now that TLCP fund is $1,100, and it would go back to the process, to the staff and back to the board to reallocate those funds to whatever is eligible to be funded by regional funds. It could be bus routes, it could be other capital projects, it could be whatever fits within the PTF parameter, the regional parameter, but it would go back into the balance as an unallocated or an unprogrammed amount of money to be programmed to whatever however the board sees fit.
And I think that's important for new board members to understand how this part of the process works.
And once again, with an idea that, remember, the TLCP runs only through June of 2026. In other words, the expiration of the Prop 400 monies. That is the way that the regional funds are dispersed in a long-term life cycle basis. So that's where it would go back into.
Any other questions on that slide?
I think you're good.
All right. We go to the 5-year sources and uses, just capturing those assumptions as a 5-year total. We're at total programming just short of $706 million. And the majority of that, $430 million or so, is actually for Valley Metro Rail capital program. Here's another look at the budget schedule. This is where we're at. So that concludes our presentation of RPTA budget. I'll turn it back to you, Chair, if there are any further questions before we move on to the Valley Metro Rail slides.
Does anybody have any other questions?
Mr. Chair, this is Bill. Final question.
Yeah, Bill.
So Mario pointed out information requests that have come up through AFS over the last few months. Are we still on target for the June AFS meeting to get the budget reduction scenario presented to us?
Yes. Yes, we are.
Okay. And I think for the rest of the board to know that AFS requested several months ago a budget reduction scenario that did not impact services. We've been waiting on that. And we should be hearing that at our June 3rd AFS meeting. That is all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Mr. Chair, this is Vice Mayor Malone. I was trying to chime in earlier, but I needed to find out, like, the city of Avondale, our council has received a request from Total Share that we have to adopt for Valley Metro by June 1st. And I'm very new, but this is what I've been told. And I just wanted to find out by Valley Metro, why did we receive that, and can we push that back? Because we're still, I don't have a full understanding of that.
Council member, you're talking about the total ride issue?
Yes.
Yeah, when Total Ride first, and thank you for the question, when Total Ride first approached us, they wanted a quick resolution, and we explained to them that we would do it as quickly as possible. The June 1st number was simply a request by them that if we do make a change in our arrangement with them, that it be implemented by June 1st. That is not a hard date. That is simply their request, and we have made it very clear to them that we will, if there is a change in our relationship with them, that it will be enacted as quickly as we can work through our process, which means complete and full consultation and feedback and decision of the impacted city members. So we're going to try and get that, simply because it's better to solve this issue as quickly as we can, but we're under no hard deadline. So to answer your question, yes, that can be pushed back and will be pushed back to whatever time we need to resolve the situation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And we met with your staff just a couple, 3 days ago, and had a very good discussion with them, since Avondale is impacted, of course. And so they may or may not have been able to give you an update as to that. But as I mentioned to Mario before, really the full decision isn't going to, an answer isn't going to come until we're able to meet with the cities and then bring everyone back together to have a group discussion. And at that point in time, and we still have some issues with the total ride as it relates to contract issues and perhaps procurement issues. This is a somewhat complex issue to resolve, or could be. And so we're looking at a lot of different angles. Once again, with the primary objective is to get a solution with as little disruption to service as we possibly can to your residents.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
this is Councilman Gomez from the City of Tolleson. Yes, there's a couple of comments. This is my second meeting, and it's been interesting, just to say the least. But City of Tolleson hasn't had any word in terms of the meeting that you mentioned, and we'll look forward to meeting with you whenever that happens. And secondly, I would agree with the members that stated that they wouldn't be comfortable voting on a budget next week. Most definitely, I would not. But looking forward to meeting with you all in the City of Tolleson. If we can schedule that as soon as possible, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, the meeting with Tolleson is scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, so that's already been scheduled. And as far as answering the questions on the RPTA budget, we will get all hands on deck to get that information out as soon as we can.
Okay, with that, we can move to the Valley Metro Rail. Thanks, Steph. So again, reviewing changes based upon the last time we shared Valley Metro Rail budget with the boards in March. We've updated our contract rates for both fare inspection security and rail transportation. The fare inspection contract had to be re-procured, so we didn't know the exact rates at the time. And there were still some negotiations with the operator rates and the labor union there. I'm happy to say that both contracts were reduced based upon those updates. On the capital side, we deferred a crossover track enhancement for FY23. We're currently in the process of applying for a grant that would really help us fund some of those costs. And we believe this crossover will be a very competitive project as part of that grant process. So here's a look at the changes to operations from the last time that we met. We've also included our preliminary operating estimates from October, which included the service and security for light rail and streetcar, as well as agency operations. That's that first pass that we provide to help get into your member city budget process. So really just to kind of show the changes from where we've come October through May. Speaking of the changes from March to May, we're down by 2.1 million or 3%. And that's really based on the changes that I mentioned in the previous slide. For our capital program, you can see some very minor adjustments overall, with the exception of the system-wide improvements line. That is the removal or deferral, I should say, to 23 of that crossover track. So that's the big decrease there. So here's back to the 21 versus 22 budget discussion with updated numbers in the 22 column. Total sources are programmed at 78.9 million. I'll get into the details of the expenses in the coming slides. Largest changes here you can see are again with the CARES Act money being fully used in 21, and then the lower CRISA funding kicking in for 22. You can see the increases in member city contributions kind of offsetting that, because right now we're using that to reduce the member city operating costs and some of those extra cleanings and other things related to the pandemic. Moving on to uses of funds for operating. So light rail and operations maintenance costs. as well as agency operating, 78.9 million. That's a 6.9 million change from prior year. I want to note the primary reason for the large increase to light rail is really around the insurance premium that we paid recently. There's been a large increase in the commercial insurance market, and so that's one of the biggest increases for light rail. The other noteworthy thing to point out here is the streetcar operations. As I mentioned, that is a new service coming on board in October is what we've planned on, depending on delivery of vehicles. But you can see that's 3.7 million and 600,000 for the year, so it's a partial year, but that is 3.6 million of the total increase there. Moving on to the capital side. Capital sources are programmed to decrease as we kind of wind down on some of our construction projects in 22. Federal funds are being drawn down as fast as we can to get those reimbursements coming as they do lag, and then therefore member city contributions kicking in. And then on the next slide, you can kind of go over those expense changes to help understand that. So you can see that Tempe and streetcar and OMC expansion, great reductions from the prior year. That's really because we're approaching the completion of those projects. And then South Central and Northwest 2 activities continue into FY22, which is really the majority of the 22 capital budget as a whole. Gilbert Road is completed. Obviously, that was a while ago, but we do have residual costs as we do have some light rail vehicle fleet, new fleet that was associated with that project that continue to come in, and so milestone payments do show up there. System-wide improvements up by 7.1 million. The main project included there is some new power switches for the 11th Street crossover. And then state of good repair continues, really based upon the timing of major overhauls of light rail assets and equipment to keep them in a state of good repair. The total program is 466.7 million for 22. Moving into our 5-year forecast. Unless there's any questions on the annual budget, take those. If not, I'll jump right in. All right. So from the operation side of things, as mentioned, Tempe streetcar comes on board in October of 21, based on timing of the vehicles. If that does move, we can adjust accordingly as far as the operations and maintenance billings for the city of Tempe. Northwest would come on board in FY24. That's January of 24, and then South Central shortly thereafter at December of 24. So fair revenue, similar to what we talked about on the RPTA side of things. We do anticipate ridership returning to pre-COVID levels by FY26, and the regional fare collection system replacement will also be implemented by FY24 and really rein in some of the opportunity for reduced fare abuse. We'll have better controls on that and do anticipate a higher fare recovery due to that. So here's a look at the ridership numbers by city. Please note that we're still looking into the fare revenue timing for FY23 as that project gets closer, and how much of an impact there will be for the whole system. But as of today, we're planning on that new system going live in May of 23. If that date holds, we do expect fare revenues to be there for both systems. The average fare for streetcar at this point is lower. Since it's just a local trip, we've programmed a full ride at $1, so compared to $2 on light rail. So 5-year operating by segment. So here's a look at the total operations and maintenance and security for the base service. The existing today light rail 27.9 miles, and then the light rail extension South Central and Northwest coming on board there. And then Tempe streetcar. I will note that Tempe streetcar, we're still working with City of Tempe staff on the specific service assumptions. And so we've included the 10-minute scenario and a wide window of service as kind of the maximum, but we are working toward different assumptions with City of Tempe that would be possibly less frequent, less span of service potentially. Five-year operating sources and uses. Again, this is in thousands for the 5-year window. They're total programmed at $435 million, with member cities making up the majority of that, since PTF cannot be used for operations on light rail. Here's a look at our overall capital program for light rail transit. In FY22, we have the 2 active construction projects that I mentioned, Northwest 2 and South Central. The remaining projects in the plan include the capital extension. Moving on to the sources and uses for the 5-year capital. Of the remaining projects, South Central is the largest at $835 million, and Northwest Phase 2 and capital extension both programmed around $240 million. So $1.5 billion in the 5-year period. With that concludes our presentation for Valley Metro Rail. I'll turn it back to you, Chair, if there are any further questions.
Anybody have any questions or concerns?
Yeah, I have a question on this, the slide where you had go back a couple slides. I'm just curious on, next one back, nope, I guess one more back. One more back. I guess so. There we go. Do we do forecasting on, for example, like cost per mile?
Yeah, so essentially the cost per mile reflected here is based on the assumed number of miles based on the assumed start dates that I mentioned, as well as the costs, the respective costs for those start dates by fiscal year. So it's really just a metric of those two.
So that's why, I guess that's why it confused me a little bit, and especially the Tempe streetcar. You would think that increased ridership would reduce the cost per mile at least, and then the implementation of the new fare collection and all of that, which I would imagine, since this is a new service, is going to be part of that. But the increase, I didn't do the math, but it's a pretty substantial increase that you're forecasting. I'm just not sure what that's based on. I mean, light rail is increased, but not nearly by a percentage of what the streetcar cost per mile forecast increased is.
So I will note that these are gross cost per mile, not net. So there's no revenues applied to these. This is just the pure cost of operating. Streetcar being in service, for 12 months each year, beginning in FY23, we do have a partial year in 22. So that would be the big jump from 22 to 23, if that's what we were drilling into, the 4.3 million versus 6.7 million. So we've got 9 months in 22 and 12 months in 23. I will note that the streetcar cost per mile, that's on a revenue mile basis. So in general, streetcar is a little more costly to put out per mile. The biggest driver of that is the operations labor, so really the operator behind the wheel. So for light rail, we typically operated 2-car consists, so we put out twice the number of miles with one operator, where streetcar is only planned to operate in one consist, one vehicle at a time with one operator. So that's why that would be higher.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Chair, this is Robin.
Yes, Robin.
just a couple things. I'm glad Lauren brought that up. I mean, obviously being a rail city, I think we really continue to work on it and struggle and make sure that we have sustainable growth. I mean, because that seems to be one thing when we talked about, even in AFS, when we started talking about rail in the budget, we started at a 12% increase. We went from 12% to 7%, and now we're at 5%. So I think one of the things that we've been really concerned about is just really understanding and making sure that we have controlled sustainable growth so all the rail cities can really understand what to expect in the future. So one of the things I think for the city of Tempe, and I think in other areas where we have large increases, we originally thought that the maintenance was for streetcar was going to be like 4.3. Now we see 4.3 as only being a partial year. So one of the things I think that we've really just got to get a better handle on, and I'm glad we continue to work through that with our staff and Valley Metro staff to ensure that we get those costs down. So, like I said, I just appreciate you guys bringing that stuff up, and being part of a rail city and having that predictability is so important too. So we can kind of help set our budget and our revenues, where they need to go. And when it fluctuates so much, it makes it really hard and complicated. But anyway, just my 2 cents. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Scott?
I don't think we have anything else if there's no further questions. Anything else to add? Appreciate
I just want to
the,
thank, Scott, I just want to thank you and your staff for taking the time to diving deep into this. I know there's some really tough questions and really good answers. I really appreciate you guys doing this for us, because, this is an important step in finalizing a budget, and the more answers that your staff can provide to the members of the board is much appreciated. So thank you.
well, Mr. Chair, we absolutely, this is our job. So we're grateful for the opportunity to have these discussions. We really are. We recognize that you, as you deal with city budgets, that sometimes we tend to speak a different language. I know when I first came here and started trying to understand some of the budget and some of the things that work, there's enough little quirky things that are involved in how we budget and what our revenues come in that makes it challenging. And we always want to be open to questions so we can perhaps have a conversation, and maybe it'll help us to communicate, because I find that a lot of things are just, sometimes we speak a different language unknowingly, and we don't try to do that, but we slip back into that, recognize that you don't live this every day, and we try to do as good a job as we can to speak in English without acronyms and things like that, but we know that we fall short sometimes. So we appreciate the questions. We appreciate, and we want you to let you know that it is in all of our interest to be, we talk a lot about transparency, to be as open as possible. I also want to just leave a couple things for your thought. As you mentioned, two of the biggest components of our budget are that we really look, when we say a 5-year window, really that is the world we live in, because it's more like a life cycle window. And a lot of the approaches and a lot of the systems that are set up are based on our life cycle, which has always been our Prop 400 cycle. And so reserves that, as Paul mentioned, that ebb and flow are always done in the context of how will these play out by the time Prop 400 expires. It just so happens to be that we're now 5 years away from Prop 400 expiring, and that's just coincidence. Last year was a 6-year window. The year before that, 7-year. So that is one difference in how we, unique thing about how we approach, and how Paul and Tyler approach a lot of the programs, a lot of things we budget, is we take this life cycle and then we reduce it to the current year, and for your approval. That creates sometimes some unique, as I've said, quirks. The other thing is that a lot of things that we do are done by contract. I think, what is it, between 75 and 80% of our operating costs are actually contracted costs with our providers, such as First Transit, ACI, Total Ride, TransDev. These are competitively bid, and they are long-term contracts, sometimes 3 to 5 years or beyond. And so a lot of times I just want to put the expectations that when we put out many of our operating expenses, a lot of those are I would say, are based on market bid and competition, competitive bids. And so we don't have a lot to play with. And there is a lot of certainty, hopefully, in the fact that we look forward to a contract that has a fixed price, and those contracts invariably have escalators in them and have other things that would cause normal and regular types of increases that we would see. So for the most of what we do, it is set by the contract that we have, depending on the service. And it is done on more of a life cycle type of thing. That doesn't mean it's completely different than the world that we all live in, but there are enough quirks that we need to do a better job of communicating that to you. So we appreciate the opportunity to do this. And I want to let you know that there is never a question that we will turn down. If you have an instance or question, please, first of all, we work a lot with your staff. And there's a lot of details. For example, we talked about the total ride issue. It's always a challenge to know when that issue has ripened to the point to bring details to the board. And so we're constantly trying to balance that out. But if you have a question, I would say first, not first, but please, your staff is deeply involved in a lot of what we do, especially Tyler and Paul, through what we call our financial working group, through RTAG, through the service planning group. But then also, please feel free to call us directly. You don't have to work through a staff. You don't have to work through an InterGov. Pick up the phone, call me, email me, call Paul. If whatever question you might have, if there's an answer we give that's confusing, incomplete, or for example, if you do lack data and you haven't gotten it, please call me directly. I'll be more than happy to do whatever I can to make sure your needs are taken care of. So with that, Mr. Chair, I thank you. I don't think we have anything else, and we appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everybody, and hope you have a great afternoon. We are adjourned. Bye-bye.